White House declares all-out war on the impeachment inquiry into President Trump, vowing zero cooperation, claiming Democrats want to just overturn the results of the 2016 election. House Speaker Nancy Pelosi, though, undeterred, firing back in her own letter that the impeachment inquiry will continue and that the President of the United States, in her words, is, quote, not above the law.
It's a constitutional crisis in the making. And crazy and frightening. That is how a White House official described the phone call between President Trump and the president of Ukraine. According to a memo written by the first whistleblower, the official was left, quote, shaken after listening in on that call, a call in which President Trump, you'll remember, pushed to have a political rival, Joe Biden, and his son Hunter Biden, investigated by a foreign power, holding leverage over that foreign power. For more on this historic fight over the balance of power, let's begin with CNN's Joe Johns. He's at the White House. Joe, the White House is making it clear here that they will fight this impeachment inquiry as they have fought other examples of congressional oversight by basically just saying, we're not going to cooperate.
That's what the White House is saying so far. And, you know, they sent that letter up to Capitol Hill, which essentially makes procedural complaints, not substantive, but procedural complaints about the way the inquiry is going. And they were pressed, though, on a call last night, a conference call with reporters as to whether the White House would cooperate with the House of Representatives inquiry if there were a full vote, which is one of the things they say hasn't happened, and that a senior administration official would not commit to actually participating in the inquiry and letting witnesses testify and so on, even if there were a vote. So we're sort of in a holding pattern on this thing right now. And I just want to read you a quote from that letter from just last night that really goes to show just how far down the road the White House already is on this. President Trump and his administration reject your baseless, unconstitutional efforts to overturn the democratic process. Your unprecedented actions have left the president with no choice. In order to fulfill his duties to the American people, the Constitution, the executive branch, and all future occupants of the office of the presidency, the president and his administration cannot participate in your partisan and unconstitutional inquiry under these circumstances. So there are some legal arguments in this letter, but this is basically a political letter to the House of Representatives telling them, no deal, we're not going to cooperate. Back to you.
Joe Johns, that has enormous consequences. Thanks very much. There are now strategic decisions for House Democrats to make. What to do next in this face-off with the president when he is not cooperating with the inquiry. CNN congressional correspondent Lauren Fox, she is live on Capitol Hill. So, Lauren, do Democrats have a plan here? It's not clear. We've been asking Democrats. It's not clear that they've expressed one or articulated one.
Well, Nancy Pelosi is basically arguing she doesn't have to hold a vote to open this impeachment inquiry. Instead, she says it's not in the Constitution. It's not in the House rules. Therefore, if she wants to have a vote, she'll have one. If she doesn't, she won't. So that's the standing right now of Democratic leaders. What they're arguing basically is the president has been obstructing their investigations for the last 8 months. This is not new. This impeachment inquiry, raises the stakes of what they're trying to do here. But this is not new. And in a letter last night, Nancy Pelosi fired back, basically saying the White House should be warned that continued efforts to hide the truth of the president's abuse of power from the American people will be regarded as further evidence of obstruction. Now, just a reminder, the paths forward here are far and few between. One of the things to remember is that if you want to go to court to enforce subpoenas, that takes time. So they may just go forward arguing that if the president and the White House does not want to comply, does not want to play ball, then that's on them. This is basically giving them an opportunity to get their truth out there. If they don't want to participate in these depositions or these document requests, that's for them to decide. Jim and Poppy?
Lauren Fox, great reporting. Thank you so much. Let's talk about all of this morning, and there is a lot. David Swerdlick, assistant editor for The Washington Post, is here. Molly Ball, national political correspondent for Time, and Elliot Williams, former federal prosecutor. Good morning, one and all. Elliot, you have a lot of experience on this side, working with congressional committees on this type of stuff. You say about this White House letter, quote, everything is wrong about this letter. Why?
Right. Well, again, they don't make or attempt to make a legal or really constitutional argument. What they do is really attack process here. So where they could have said, you can't establish that the president committed an impeachable offense, or where they could have said, regardless of what you think of the president's conduct, he's the president of the United States, and under Article 2 of the Constitution, he's allowed to engage in foreign. They don't do any of that. They make up a lot of arguments out of thin air, including, and I've got one right here, they say that impeachment should only be used to, quote, defend our system of government or our constitutional liberties against a dire threat. That's just not accurate. That's not in the Constitution, and they're making this stuff up to sort of craft these political arguments. Another thing that's troubling, really quickly, is this idea, and they talk about it a few times in the letter, the president talks about it too, of using impeachment to, quote, overturn the results of an election and to try to skew 2020. If that's the case, you're never, ever again going to be able to impeach a president of the United States, because they're always just off of an election or going, sometimes going into a new one. So they're really just making stuff up.
Molly, what's not clear to me, though, is what the strategy is for Democrats to respond to this, if, and it looks like this is going to be the case, if the White House continues to stonewall here. I asked a member of the Judiciary Committee yesterday this very question. Listen to his answer, and I want to get your response. Sounds like Democrats are still trying to develop a strategy.
Well, I think we are, and I think Judiciary had the same problem. We were stonewalled. People refused to comply with subpoenas. We've gone to court on contempt case citations, but the courts are still ruling, or they've been appealed. But I think all of this does show obstruction of Congress, and that can be a charge in itself.
Get evidence of obstruction charge to Congress, but if they can't explore the central issue here because the White House stonewalls on witnesses, documents, text messages, emails, etc., what do? What are the options?
Well, I think you see them doing what they have been doing, which is continue to ask for things and then not get them, and continue to try to make the case in the court of public opinion that what the administration is doing is itself an abuse of power, is itself grounds for impeachment, and then continue to wait on these court processes, which, as Elliot was saying, can be lengthy. But they don't really have any other choice. I mean, in the system, there's only one way to enforce the law, and that's to proceed through the process of law enforcement and the judiciary, and that can take time. Does it eventually come to a head? Is there eventually a final verdict, whether it's the Supreme Court or anything else? You also have some Democratic members of Congress talking about the inherent contempt power, which has almost never been used, but saying, is there some other way that we can hold people accountable if they won't comply with these requests? Can we put them in jail? Can we fine them? And so there's a lot of options being explored. This is all uncharted territory because so much of it is unprecedented, because the administration is responding in these very extreme ways, which even previous presidents who faced impeachment have not gone to quite these lengths.
Okay, so on David, to Molly's point about the court of public opinion, there is a really interesting piece in the Journal this morning, the Wall Street Journal. It's from the editorial board. Here it is. The headline is Impeachment in Secret. Let me just read you the first few lines here. Sure. Democrats are moving fast towards what looks like an inevitable vote to impeach the president. Why aren't they doing more to persuade Americans who don't already agree with them? They will not convince anyone else with their current method of irregular order, secret hearings, and selective leaks to the pro-impeachment press. They go on to say, for example, the whistleblower. This is someone who should testify in public. Obviously, there are security concerns about that. But I wonder if you find any salience in the argument that if you're going to sway people that aren't swayed yet, you can't have much of it done in private.
Yeah, good morning, Poppy. So it seems like the Wall Street Journal editorial board is running a little interference there for the White House, but I don't think their argument is going to work that well for this reason. The key facts in this case, in this episode, are already out there. The White House released a partial transcript of the call with President Zelensky. The whistleblower complaint is already out there. Some of the text messages, I realize Republicans want more of the text messages. Some of the text messages between some of the key players are out there, so the public can make up its minds about the basic sort of text of what's at issue here without being present for all of these hearings and without hearing from all of the witnesses. Yes, the Democrats have a responsibility to investigate this thoroughly and to be as transparent as possible, but this isn't a situation where people don't know what's basically at issue here. They know that the president said, I need you to do me a favor. though. So Democrats will make up their minds, Republicans will make up their minds, and the public will make up their minds primarily on those facts and some of these issues related to that op-ed, and also in the White House counsel's letter, I think are a lot about process, which we know from the Mueller report hasn't resonated as much with the public.
Timeline, Molly Ball, because Nancy Pelosi posited a pretty aggressive timeline for getting through and finishing this impeachment inquiry. You heard initial talk by Thanksgiving. If the White House is stonewalling on each of these things and wants to take to court, we know if it goes to court, it's going to take much longer than that. Has that Democratic timeline effectively been blown up here?
I don't think we know yet. I think it was from the beginning a very ambitious timeline, to say the least. Congress isn't known for moving fast on anything, and particular, as you said, there are so many obstacles to this process being created for the White House itself. I think that Democrats are also sending a message to the White House that it's up to them whether they want to draw out this process, which so far looks like it is politically damaging for the White House. It looks like, despite, the argument that the Journal is making, actually we have poll after poll after poll showing that support for impeachment among the public has risen quite sharply. So people are apparently being persuaded that there is something here. This process so far, which has been happening while Congress has been out of session. I think that's another important thing to mention. Right. Congress comes back into session next week. There will be more open hearings when Congress is in session. There will conceivably also be more chaos and circus and things that are confusing to digest. But so far, this process has unfolded almost completely in a situation where there's just a skeleton crew of committee members here in Washington, and most of Congress doesn't come back until next week.
It'll be harder for lawmakers of both parties to hide from making public comments on this when they're walking around the halls.
There you go.
David Swerdlow, Molly Ball, Elliot Williams, thanks to all of you.
Thanks.
Thank you.
And of course, we are following this breaking news this morning out of Germany. Right new this morning, two sources tell CNN that President Trump directed his energy secretary, Rick Perry, and two top State Department officials to circumvent official channels and to have his personal attorney, Rudy Giuliani, deal with a potential meeting with the Ukrainian president. Now, one source says the president believed that Ukraine was still rampantly corrupt and said if Ukrainian President Zelensky wanted to meet with him, he would have to convince Rudy Giuliani first. The president's push to have Giuliani as the gatekeeper essentially here demonstrates how significant a role Giuliani has been playing in brokering access to the president, specifically regarding Ukraine policy and passing messages to other administration officials.
Joining me now to discuss, James Clapper. He's former director of national intelligence. He's also a CNN national security analyst. General Clapper, thank you for joining us this morning.
Thanks.
So you worked for nearly 50 years in government and in intelligence. Tell us the significance of a sitting president using his personal lawyer to broker decisions, key decisions, with what is a key national security partner of the U.S.
Well, this is yet another example, Jim, of the unconventional, unorthodox, unprecedented processes that this administration uses in conducting business. And throughout this Ukraine saga, just what the role of Rudy Giuliani has not been real clear, whether he was acting as the president's attorney or acting on his own. And of course, this had to really complicate life for the State Department, particularly the career Foreign Service officers who were involved in or had some role in the Ukraine portfolio. So this is just another example of this as I say, unorthodox approach.
I want to ask about consequences here. This is just a basic question. You spent 2016 as Director of National Intelligence identifying and seeking to push back against foreign interference in the U.S. presidential election. As you look at what President Trump did here, is his pressure on Ukraine, his outreach, his use of leverage on Ukraine to get them to investigate Joe Biden, in the simplest terms, is that a U.S. president participating in foreign interference, or at least encouraging foreign interference in the upcoming U.S. election?
Yeah, exactly, Jim. You think after all the trauma of the 2016 election and the profound, deep Russian systemic and widespread, I think was a paraphrase of the Mueller report, interference in our election process in 2016, you'd think there'd be a lesson there. And here is the president himself, who really never bought into that thesis, I guess. He was a non-believer in the Russian interference, even though the evidence for it is quite overwhelming and has been verified multiple times, most recently, by the way, by the Senate Intelligence Committee. Yeah. So the fact that he would actively solicit foreign countries' involvement in our election is just appalling and incredible.
We know Russia will try again in 2020. That's the assessment of U.S. intelligence agencies. Since President Trump never talks about election security as a priority, in fact, he's resisted, according to his own cabinet officials, discussing that or having cabinet-level meetings on it. I just wonder for folks at home, we have an election in 13 months. Russia will try to interfere. Can Americans have confidence in this election if their sitting president shows no interest in protecting or prioritizing protecting that election?
First of all, it won't be just Russia, because I think others will have gone to school and seen the success of the Russian interference in 2016. And so others with different axes to grind, notably Iran or North Korea and China as examples, are also going to participate. I am sure that a lot has been done to enhance the security of our election apparatus in preparation for 2020. I think the FBI, Department of Homeland Security, National Security Agency, and others have done this, as well as the states. But you have to remember that our election process and the apparatus that supports it is very decentralized among 50 states and local entities. So I think at that level, probably progress towards securing the voter apparatus, the election apparatus, is probably uneven at best. But what's missing is the galvanizing effect of the president championing election security in the minds of the American people and the American electorate. And that's just been a big void.
Yeah. Well, if folks at home care about it, they should call their congressman or woman. James Clapper, Director Clapper, thanks very much.
Thanks, Jim.
Well said. All right, major development in the Middle East. Turkey's president just saying moments ago the offensive against Kurdish forces in Syria is now officially underway. We're live on the Syrian border. Next.
We're Oscar Mayer.
Going to war on the House impeachment inquiry, and they are tell CNN he would not join the administration but would help them wage the impeachment fight from the outside. You can imagine that would mean a lot of TV appearances. Joining me now to talk about that, CNN legal analyst Ross Garber. Of course, he teaches impeachment law at Tulane. He also has represented 4 governors who faced impeachment. So you have a little bit of expertise in this arena, Ross. Thank you for being here. Look, I don't think, whether you like his politics or not, Trey Gowdy is a skilled litigator. He's a good lawyer, right? And he can make an effective, compelling argument. But remember when he said this? Listen.
The notion that you can withhold information and documents from Congress, no matter whether you're the party in power or not in power, is wrong. Respect for the rule of law must mean something irrespective of the vicissitudes of political cycles.
Does that from 2012 make it a little bit harder for him to defend the administration's stonewalling now?
I think we're going to be seeing a lot of that. And I think what we'll also be seeing is that he and others distinguish what was happening then from what's happening now. And I think one of the things he probably brings to the table is the ability to sort of get the Republicans in Congress really on board. There were some, rumblings yesterday that, maybe Republicans in the House were surprised by the White House's approach to all this. You don't want surprise in your base. And I think Gowdy may help with that. And I think what he'd say is, yeah, that was different. There we were doing regular oversight. This is an impeachment inquiry. And I think what he'd say is, the rules from past impeachment inquiries were different than they are in this one. And that makes all the difference.
Okay, so let's dig into that a little bit, because you have some thoughts on the letter that the White House sent to Democratic leadership, and the argument here by White House counsel that sort of absent a vote on an official vote on an impeachment inquiry, the president and other members of the executive branch, they're arguing in this letter, will be denied their basic rights, due process, fairness, etc. Is there any merit in that argument?
Yeah, so there actually is, and that letter played, right to Trump's base. That was not an effort to convince Democrats or probably even centrist voters. That played to Trump's base. But there's something there, and it's less about a vote by the full House, although I think they'd say that's a prerequisite. Instead, there's something a little bit different going on. What they're referring to is in the two previous recent impeachment efforts, Clinton and Nixon, there was a set of rules that applied in the committee once the impeachment process started.
Right.
And it was the same identical set of rules. And under those rules, the president's lawyers got rights to be at all the hearings, to cross-examine witnesses, to call witnesses, to participate in the process. And that's lacking here. And I think their point is, why change the rules? Why is this different? Why not apply the same rules as in Nixon and Clinton, and why not do this in a fair way? I think that's their point, and it has some merit, actually.
In both of those cases of impeachment or inquiries, the minority had the right to subpoena witnesses. And there are some that are arguing that one reason why Nancy Pelosi, might not want to risk a vote is not just for, putting vulnerable members on the record, but also having to determine those rules.
Yeah, and that's been something I've been saying, is once you're actually all in on an impeachment, then those issues become much more prominent. And yes, in addition to the minority having rights, the president's lawyers would have rights too. And I think they just don't like the idea of the potential spectacle of Rudy Giuliani or another one of the president's lawyers having the ability to participate fully in these processes or even attend. Yeah.
Quickly before you go, there is the argument that's been made on our air. Congressman Mike Quigley said it to us yesterday about, he sees multiple examples of obstruction here that could be articles of impeachment. You don't think that's enough for Democrats, though?
Yeah, it's not going to work. An article based on obstruction came out of committee in the Nixon case, but it was never voted on by the full House because Nixon resigned. In Clinton, the full House rejected that kind of article. Here where it would be based on something that the White House would claim is assertion of executive privilege or executive prerogatives, I just don't think it's going to work, and I think it probably doesn't even get a majority of House members to vote for it. They're going to need something of substance to convince the American people that this president should be removed. And an impeachment process, yes, it leads to a trial in the Senate. But in the minds of the American people and in the process, it is the first step in removing a president. And I don't think that's going to happen based on refusal to provide witnesses and documents when there are actually legitimate complaints about fairness.
Well, if that's the case, clearly that's what the White House is banking on. Ross Garber will have you back a lot, I'm sure, through this process. Thank you very much.
Good to see you, Poppy.
Just moments ago, this breaking news. Turkey's President Erdogan saying the military offensive in northern Syria has begun. This, of course, follows the president's decision to withdraw U.S. troops from the area. According to the Syrian Democratic Forces, gaining steam. In others, the indicators a little contradictory.
That's right. There are a lot of numbers out there. A new Quinnipiac poll shows support for the impeachment inquiry now stands at 53% among American voters. This follows a new poll in the Washington Post showing support at 58%, up from 37% in July. But some other numbers, when you ask about removal from office, are lower. David Swerdlick is with us. David, what do you see in these numbers, looking at the totality of them? Because when you look at the Quinnipiac poll, when it asked should the president be impeached or removed from office, more people say no. 49% say no, and 45% say yes.
Right. So, Poppy, it's always important to remember when you're looking at polls that polls are a snapshot of where you are at a given time, whether you're talking about an election poll or, in this case, an impeachment poll. But right now, as you pointed out, the trend is favoring what the Democrats are doing. Back in July, our Washington Post poll only showed 37% of people favored an inquiry. Now, 58% favor it. That's a slim majority, but the direction is heading in favor of what the Democrats are doing. Right. In neither this poll nor the Quinnipiac poll does a majority of the public favor removing the president, but I still think right now, at least, this is generally a good sign for what Democrats are doing from their perspective, because they know they're not going to remove the president. Republicans control the Senate. The Senate requires a 2/3 majority vote to remove the president. So the Democrats have narrow support in both the Post poll and the Q poll for the inquiry. The trend is heading in their direction. And you have a situation where Democrats are going to do the inquiry and probably an impeachment vote. But that's just an indictment, not a removal.
Now, Republicans, though, look at different numbers. There's some internal polling that shows in swing districts, and that, of course, is key to the control of the House, that a majority of voters in those swing districts do not support the impeachment inquiry. And I wonder if you see that as what's informing the almost across-the-board silence from Republican lawmakers on this.
Right. Well, I think in general, with impeachment and with a lot of other issues, many Republicans, whether they're in swing districts or even solidly Republican districts, generally have not found that it's in their interests to cut against President Trump, because President Trump, in many cases, is more popular with Republican voters than even their own constituents. And so these members of Congress. So Republicans have to be careful on this politically, even though in theory you would vote for impeachment based on whether or not you find validity to the impeachment charges. That's the situation they're faced with.
David,